Good evening. My name is John McMorrow, Section Head for Architecture at the Knowlton School, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to Territories, the Fall 2009 KSA Lecture Series. In our examination of the topic territory, we understand that a territory, from the word terra, meaning land, is a defined area, including land and waters, considered to be the possession of a person, an organization, an institution, an animal, or state. And here we could add as well a discipline, be it architecture, landscape architecture, or city and regional planning. It is an abstract domain overlaid upon a multiplicitous reality. It is, in one way or another, a claim of propriety. The nature of this propriety, in respect to its the nature of this propriety, either in respect to its bounds or its transgression, implies the focus of these lectures. Tonight's speaker, Matthijs Bouw, is an architect, but his work, I could say, is not strictly bound by that categorical definition. Bouw is the founder and principal of the Amsterdam-based One Architecture. One Architecture works internationally on a broad range of projects, including the transformation of a 1957 listed monastery into a health center, the urban renewal of one of the Netherlands' most notorious post-war neighborhoods, and the definition of key projects for the Dutch government's Randstad 2040 vision. One Architecture and Matthijs Bouw frequently collaborate on projects with other designers, firms, and artists, and use design to engage economic, social, political, and cultural environments. The diversity of projects and collaborations are a testament to the practice where content triumphs signature. Matthijs Bouw has published articles and reviews in many architectural publications, such as Wederhal, De Architect, Arcus, Werkbouw en Wonen, Bouwveld, and Mono. In 2006, the Korean DD series published a monograph on One Architecture's work. In addition to his practice and publications, Matthijs teaches and lectures internationally at institutions including the Technical University at Delft, the Berlage Institute, the Technical University of Graz, SciArc, and Aachen. Please join me in welcoming Matthijs Bouw.
Thank you, John, for having me here. There was a time when there were people who still thought they could make sense of the landscape of architecture, and they made these beautiful diagrams positioning the different firms in relation to each other. And as you can see, someone tried it for Dutch architecture, and they put two basic streams. One on the top was rationalism, and on the bottom was modernism. And out of modernism came all the interesting offices, such as OMA, MVRDV, Knox, and all the offices that you might have heard about. And our firm was positioned amidst all the boring offices in a category called pragmatism, basically saying that we are probably not steered by ideology, but by pragmatics. And I've always found this a very interesting diagram because it says a lot about our discomfort with all what our profession can do. I could talk a bit more about the planning and the urbanism that we do, because I think the fact that we do planning and urbanism with its need for openness, with its need for communication, with its need for flexibility, which is need for an involvement in the world around you, really also informs our architecture. This is a plan that is somewhat known because we did it together with OMA and Xavier de Geiter for the Leal, the center in the center of Paris, a competition that we barely lost. But rather than talking about that, I just take two projects. I call them the Deventer projects. There are more Deventer projects on the way, but I will explain these two. And the first one is an urban planning project in which our firm uses extra architectural tools, as I call them, to reframe the position of the public parties in an era of privatization. That is something that is very important driver of the Dutch architecture and urban planning. And secondly, an architecture project for a community health center made possible in part by the success of, rather than on, of the first. And between those projects, and it might be confusing, I put some reflections on how our profession can be a bit what I call post-autistic. There is, I think, and especially in America, a real focus on a discipline. There is a focus on the moment of triumph of the signature architect. There is a focus on the technology within the discipline. And I think our work is much messier than that, much less controlled, much more open in the fact that it takes within itself all kinds of other things that are happening in society, or personal obsessions, or collaborations, or positions that you find yourself in. And I think that is both its strength and its weakness. The first project is Deventer Geertruiden, and Deventer is a provincial town about 60 miles east of Amsterdam, located beautiful on the IJssel River, and it's one of the oldest towns in Holland. But before I take you there, I need to say a bit about planning in Holland. Planning in Holland has a very long tradition. We are a country that is 70% below sea level, and we needed to plan in order to keep ourselves dry. We needed to build coalitions between private parties, farmers, and public bodies in order to build the dikes that kept our country dry and that need to continue to keep us dry. Water management and the fact that that is a fundamental basis for planning is still one of the main issues that you're dealing with, but it is also the main, it has created a lot of other planning mechanisms which are still very strong. Planning is really something that is at the heart of our society. We have invented our country ourselves, and one of the things that we, for instance, have invented as a result of this need to do our water management is a landscape in which we say we need to keep it open because we need it for water storage, and that means that the urban centers or the villages need to be tightly controlled. Here you see a planning map that is relatively recent of a part of Holland, and rather than in America where new developments would sprawl, you see here the red contours marking the boundaries about which you cannot cross for new developments. That basically means that in Holland, planning will always be successful. It will always be successful because there's a scarcity of land. So no matter what you build, it will always sell. And that is a very interesting thing that you have to deal with as an architect. You don't have to make quality. You can just build whatever. That meant that at the moment that the economy was well, a lot of architects, and that is one of the successes of Dutch architecture, got commissions in which they could experiment because it would sell anyway. At the moment when the economy was going badly, we get a more traditional type of architecture. This is more or less what Holland looks like. Here you see, this is what we call a suburb, a very compacted way of building, such that very artificial, such that the rest of the country can keep open. As in the rest of the world, of course, since the mid-80s, a social democratic model, in which the government played a large role in planning, has given way to privatization and liberalization. That is a worldwide trend that we find, and that has really created the condition in which all kinds of former public bodies have stopped being involved with planning on the lower scale. Where it used to be that planning was done by municipalities, and semi-government organizations, by now the market has taken over. The question is what that would mean for the future. We are at this moment doing for the national government a project in which we think about the question if the bailout and the financial crisis will change the course of this planning for the national government, but on the local level you really see that planning has become privatized, or as the socialists amongst us would say, sold off to their great dismay. And here I end with the context. One of the formerly public bodies that is now privatized is the healthcare industry. The healthcare industry used to be, until 2005, completely government run, but are now private, and that meant something also for planning, because the lands of the hospitals suddenly became a valuable asset, and they could be sold off to developers in order to strengthen the balanced position of the hospitals, and it was often done so. We encountered a hospital that was about to move. And what will then happen, of course, in these hospital lands is that this gets built by private developers. Hospitals would sell lands, private developers would buy it, they would allot it in many privatized parts, and they would build our versions of colonial Greek or New England styles that you have, which is a sort of faux modernism mixed with 30s style, all in brick. The country now, and that's of course the architecture of the crisis, it's the architecture without the experiment, is full of this. And this was the thing that would happen to the hospital in Deventer, who was leaving two sites. If not, we had talked to the director of the hospital, who asked us basically to make an allotment plan for one of the sites that he was going to leave, such that he could sell it off to a developer. We said, we can do better than this. This is not how you want to leave this site in Deventer, at which you have a beautiful 1930s hospital complex, and in which you have a sort of great urban quality. We don't want this 6 hectare sites to be demolished and subdivided into separate plots and built with the two under a roof, as they are called. And we said we can do that differently, because rather than immediately selling the plot at a strategic location in Deventer, we can try to understand how developers work and maybe devise a strategy that we can, that will allow us to, for you, generate more revenue of the sale, and for the city to create a better quality. And in order to explain that, I have to explain a bit this diagram, where from the left to the right you see the three phases of a real estate development. On the left, you have the first phase, which is the landowner, who basically sells after maybe land preparation, after maybe the title of on a land changes the land to a developer. In that process, value is added. Then the developer takes over, and he basically makes a plan, he builds it, he'll finance it. And whereas the landowner has a process which has a relatively short time, much of the value is added in the longer span that the developer works to build a plan. And then the third phase is the end user. Then it's the investor. That could be a family, that could be a business, that could be an insurance company, that could be a fund who buys the project and basically has an investment, gets a return, for instance, in rents paid. Normally, a hospital would immediately sell at the beginning of this diagram. And what we said, let's see if we can move a bit longer into the process, because if we do that, the hospital will make more money. It is relatively simple. And in order to do that, we basically devised a strategy that was based on this graph, in which we said, on the top, you have the normal way in which a developer develops land, and you have at the beginning, in terms of time, the revenue that is from the land owner. And what we can do is by selling later, we can increase the revenue. But there's a second mechanism that works. We can say, if we have an increase in revenue because of the fact that we sell later, maybe we should not go for the maximum in the terms of the total revenue. We rather reinvest in quality, because quality reduces risk, because quality makes it possible that the community starts approving a plan. A quality makes it possible that that a plan gets a new title quicker and thus gains in money. Sorry for being a bit tedious about this, but this is, I think, a very important mechanism that we had come to first understand and then to invent in order to be able to function well as urban planners and to not be confronted with a simply subdivided plot with no public space and 30s housing. Because we said at this site there is actually quite a lot of quality already. There are beautiful parks, because in the past people needed to be able to walk around the hospitals. And there's a quite attractive 30s building which has an interesting setup because it has a couple of arms extending into the park-like environment, basically making sure that it didn't appear too massive. And at the same time, it has an interesting courtyard allowing for a certain compactness. And the first thing that we did in this plan is we said, rather than demolishing this, why cannot we reuse it? So we developed a way to reuse this existing complex and to make it into about 100 different apartments and townhouses. Given the fact that this was reusable and could create qualities that are much more interesting than the normal subdivision, that is, it could create qualities that can be found in the city already, that is, community gardens, little parks, etc. We said, why not we keep this figure and see if, because it is so suited on this site already, let's see if we can demolish the rest of the complex and then simply repeat it. If this model of this existing building is already well suited for the site, let's repeat it a couple of times, because then that repetition is also well suited for the site, such that after that we could differentiate the complex according to maybe the users, maybe the type of apartments, maybe the type of architecture that we want. And as you would understand here, of course, a difference and repetition. A book by Gilles Deleuze, written in the late 60s, has been very influential. In the same way as the architect Peter Eisenman read a book also by Deleuze called The Fold and started making folding buildings visible here in this city, we were simply reading Gilles Deleuze and said we should repeat and differentiate. And we actually did that, and these are some of the differentiations that can be thought then out of this repetition from a very early point in our career. It is something that has started with the very first commission that we had in Salzburg, Austria. Salzburg, Austria is a city in which you have a Green Party that really tries to aim for high quality planning and a high public involvement in the planning. So when I came there for the first time as a 28-year-old boy who had just started his practice, in order to visit a site on which we were supposed to do an invited competition, we were put in front of this is the site, a beautiful meadow with some different types of housing in it. We were put in front of 500 angry neighbors who spoke in a Salzburg dialect and whom I was completely unable to comprehend, except for the fact that it was very clear that they didn't want anything new in this neighborhood, which is of course always the instinct of neighborhoods. And I, at that moment, thought that I had to take this very seriously. I'd never been in front of 500 angry Austrians whom I could not understand at all before, so I repeated their words. I say, we will not build anything new. And that eventually won us the competition, because what we did, here you see the eventual project. We said, well, if this is what they have now, we were just looking at these collective apartment buildings. If you have now an area that basically extends from this street, in which you have some single-family houses, some apartment buildings, a new electricity sculpture made by the architects Beatrix and Consolatio, but for the rest you had also these beautiful meadows. Why shall we not repeat what is already there? So building new, nothing new, meant for us simply repeating what is already there, because like the Dutch, the Austrians are social democrats, so they cannot be, from the point of view of equality, against that. We thought that from a social democratic perspective, nothing new would mean the possibility of repeating the collective apartments, repeating the electricity sculpture, repeating the single-family houses, and repeating the meadow. And of course, then, the next step would be to bring in differentiation. To bring in differentiation such that the project would comply with all the questions that would be there, such as the fact that one electricity sculpture had to become a bigger student housing building and would better be one block, such as the fact that these single-family houses would make it necessary to allot or subdivide this meadow. And rather than subdividing this meadow, we said, why don't we give everyone 1 meter of garden, literal stripe gardens across the meadow, and we get out of that an organization which is such that we needed to put all 270 houses on this garden, so we get this Gothic structure. So nothing new, through repetition and differentiation, helped us win this competition. Nothing new is also something that we have used in this project. This is the second project of our office, which is the 6 under a tennis court, and in which the idea came from the fact that in this area west of Utrecht there were these beautiful power lines, like some relic from the Industrial Revolution, and they had these beautiful tennis balls in there. And we said, well, we'll repeat the tennis balls by putting actual tennis in this area and develop out of that this housing type, the 6 under a tennis court, where 6 dwellings would share one tennis court, basically freeing us from all other urban considerations. Once we had a colossal order, as it's called in architecture, of tennis in this area, once the area was filled with tennis, we didn't have to worry about geometry anymore. We didn't have to worry about clever corner solutions. We didn't have to worry about the fact whether the houses had some kind of resemblance to each other. Basically, the colossal order of tennis freed us from a lot of other architectural considerations, which, given the fee we were paid, was not a bad idea at all. The tennis balls then, of course, became the tennis balls that were played here, the ones that were hit up sometimes too high, that started interfering with the new tennis ball on the power lines, which we fitted out with actual light, because we thought with light they would be much more beautiful, to the biggest tennis ball of all, the sun. Repetition is a powerful instrument, and using what is already there is a powerful instrument, because it frees architecture from a lot of its neurosis. Our repetition scheme was basically translated into this plan, with whom we convinced the municipality and the community of the additional quality that would be given in this area. As you see, all the stuff from the 60s and 70s would be demolished, and to this area, a nice public park structure would be added. Basically comprising of large public gardens, some smaller gardens connected to the houses, parking underneath these condensed blocks, and nice spaces on the interior of these blocks. And that plan, of course, met with applause, and it also really, and we had some marketing people help us with that. It also met with a lot of the lifestyle requirements that were needed in order to convince later on the developers that they should buy this. We showed to the neighborhood how great the future would become, got a new title to the land, and had to then produce the legal framework in which we defined the quality of this site before it would be sold off to a developer. And I think that is a next really interesting step of in architecture that offices could become interested in, and that could allow them to make new types of planning, is to think about the legal mechanisms with which, for instance, zoning plans, or as you in Dutch have the visual quality plans, are made. An understanding of not only the financial mechanisms, but also of the legal mechanisms in which you operate has become more and more crucial in order to be able to make your own architecture and to create this quality. And I think what is very important to say is, of this development process, what we try to do is do the things on the left corner, because that we could do much better as representatives of the hospital of a former public party, but we needed to make sure that the stuff on the right could still be done by the developers, because if we would make a plan that is too constraining, in which we dictated all the housing types, the phasing, the numbers, then the developer could not do what he does well, and the value of the land would be reduced. So one of the things that we needed to learn and understand is, how do you do a zoning plan? And a traditional zoning plan in Holland looks sort of like this, and that is, of course, what we use for this existing building that we wanted to keep. But for the new buildings, we try to develop a different way of writing a zoning plan, and we hired legal experts and geographers to work with us on that, because if we would find a different way of writing, we could assure the quality and at the same time give the freedom that is necessary for the developer. So we worked with shifting margins, with percentages. We almost made what I think in architecture at this moment is called a parametric architecture into a legal document of the zoning plan. So I think we've learned in that sense really a lot from Greg Lynn and all his successors, but we used it in quite a different way to see if we can make a parametric zoning plan that would allow a lot of different configurations, and we actually showed these possible configurations because we needed to make sure that while giving freedom, the quality of the plan would always remain good. And the second document which organizes quality is this visual quality plan that comes in Holland next to the zoning plan. And that tries to define the architectural quality and the public space quality. And there we also discovered or invented a new way of writing down the qualitative components that we wanted to have. And basically what we said, if this is in some way a family of buildings, why don't we establish what we call a DNA relationship between these buildings? Why don't we describe the existing building that we wanted to keep, that we are repeating, and say, if this is the DNA of the building, then in repeating, a certain percentage of that DNA should be repeated. And we use different categories to show DNA, and here we say how that could work. We could say if you have a repetition of the building, but the DNA color is not repeated, then suddenly this can become this as a free repetition. If the DNA element architectural style is not repeated, this can become this. Or if the DNA component footprint is only partly repeated, then this can become this. So we said by using DNA as a logic, we can give a lot of freedom to the eventual architects in the site who have to do projects there for the developer. And basically what we said, then this building should be, because it was a hospital and it will become something else, will have 75% DNA. These complexes will have 50% of these DNAs, and some other elements will have more scattered DNA or no DNA at all. Basically, this regulatory framework was then approved by the city council, and having changed the title, that meant that a lot of the risks that a developer would normally face, what can I build on an area, will I get neighborhood opposition, all these things were covered, these risks were reduced, and that meant that we could potentially get a much higher price for it. And in order to go one step further with that, we made hired designers, hired lawyers, hired financial experts, and organized an auction of this site, because an auction mechanism is the purest way to let the market do its work, and basically auctioned off the land, not as land, but as a plan that was approved and that still gave the developer freedom. And that's, and here again is this graph. That really resulted in a remarkable result, because at the beginning the financial experts had said we would get 5 million euros for this land, and we ended up getting 23.1 million, which is a fourfold increase in value, while also the community benefited because they would get a park. They would not, they would still have public space there. There was a plan that was much nicer for the community, and the value of the surrounding 30s houses would not be destroyed for the next 10 years because there will be built another 200. So it was a really a deal where through design and through understanding the processes through which architecture, urbanism, and planning works, we were able to generate value not only in terms of money, but also in terms of quality. And you see it here, we were the ones who made the highest amount of money, and also in terms of goodwill. I'll get back to the second project that came out of this goodwill and out of the fact that the hospital was suddenly loaded with money. So we could propose something rather drastic later. But first I want to talk a bit about what I think are the political implications of that and which are the professional implications. I think that we have seen also in Holland a sort of withdrawing of the public dimension in planning and in architecture. And I think that people of our profession should find the tools to take back that public dimension. And the fact that I basically kept 23 million, or 23 minus 5, 18 million euros in the hands of a semi-public institution and out of the pockets of developers while making a better plan is a very nice starting point, because it means in Holland that this hospital can keep their oncology department, can keep jobs in the community. So in that sense, I think that dimension, that inventing new tools in order to have a public role is very important. The other thing which I always found, I think, very important in my work is that, and that's also, I think, a political point of view, that you need to be able to leave the discipline relatively open and to find ways in the planning to have all the other actors in this world to give them a role. And I think that started already with my first building that I made when I was still a student, which was a daycare center. And the whole theme of this daycare center was to say if daycare centers are organized in order to control kids, if they are organized to become a womb-like environment that parents feel comfortable with, if they are always a piece of, let's say, reassuring architecture, I want to make a daycare center that is wild, adventurous, in which kids can break legs, in which can kids, because of that, develop themselves, and in which the kids can free themselves from the control of the people guarding them. That meant, at that moment, to make a building that was, on the one hand, highly complex. It was a school that we remodeled and basically messed up so much that all the panoptical logic of the school was destroyed by making hidden spaces, making places where grown-ups couldn't go, building stairs and all these things, but also making a different type of architecture, architecture that was less formal, less aesthetic, because of that less reassuring. And the third point in relation to the discipline was also that I did it with a couple of fellow students, and we basically said this is also a project that should have no author. It is a building that we just make as a group of people, but this whole notion of authorship in a project is also as totalitarian as the panoptical system of the school, or as the idea of building this sort of womb. So basically, on many levels, we try to open up many of the normal functions of architecture. We also did that in this series of projects, which is a lecture tour that I did about 2 years ago in Northwest Pacific America, in which we thought that rather than giving lectures to professionals, it would be interesting to also give lectures to high school kids. So we organized a series of architectural dance parties in which we had local bands. One of the co-organizers was the president of Sub Pop Records, so that helped. We organized different architecture lectures and music performances, basically creating this wonderful mix of Armani-clad architecture interests and high school kids, and then being very, I was always very interesting to see at what moment which group would leave. It was the Armani Clet who usually left first. Part of the tour was also this little project that we did for the Unassociated Writers Conference in Vancouver, BC, in which we said that the space for unassociation could maybe be easily made not by a complex architecture like the daycare, because that's the way the people who invited me had foreseen that, but done with media projections, a rented bouncy castle, and a number of sheets that we have stolen from our hotel room. It's Canada, so you can sort of do that there. And basically what we did is we made a beautiful little a white cube on which we projected the different events there, and rather than taking these projections too seriously, although you could get really into them, they were nicely complemented by people who enjoyed their bouncy castle in the middle. A third project, I think, which also deals with, I think, the limits of architecture and a sort of trying to attempt to not go too far in designing everything, is this urban plan for the center of Eindhoven, in a site where there were two moderately interesting old buildings. And the reason they were moderately interesting was not because of their architecture, but because there were cool people doing cool things in there. It was a temporary art center in which artists and designers and architects worked. And within a West 8 plan, which called basically for the erasure of all this mess, we had to do an urban plan which had quite a bit of program, and we said, well, if we have to do all this program, we would like to keep the small scale of the area. And what we would do, we would also like to keep all the buildings that are there, because why throw these people out, whereas they're doing cool things and they can really animate a city. So we built a plan that was carefully centered around these buildings and not having quite the space. We said that we needed to cut up some parts from the existing buildings, but we said you're already very good at that because you are doing these. We have a wooden structure there, so it makes it relatively easy. And there are a lot of inspirations of even artworks that can play with this cutting up mechanism, basically resulting in a proposal that turned out like this, that I'm still fighting with Adriaan Geuze over, because he hates this type of sloppiness, being the strong Dutchman that he is, but which I think is very, very valuable in the fact that it allows all these things which are not necessarily in the domain of space and architecture to still exist in this area. A third or fourth project of that type I will skip, except for the fact that sometimes we try to do also installation works in which we try to discuss these things and in which we make films about that, which I will skip in order to go back to Deventer. Armed with 23 million euros, we started looking at the second site the Deventer Hospital would be leaving. The Deventer Hospital was moving to the edge of town in a new facility. And we proposed to transform part of the complex of another site, the Jozef site, into a community health center. The Jozef site is also an interesting site. It was built about 20 years later than the other sites. And here is the entire site with the main building of the hospital and the rest of the hospital behind it. What is interesting about this particular site is built in 1957. It was the former Catholic hospital. And out of Catholicism came a couple of interesting things. It meant that because the Catholic Church wanted to make it appear as if they are there forever, as an institution with a historical continuity, the entire complex was made as if it has always been there. The 1957 building looked as if it was made of brick, and it had a Renaissance order as if it had been there at least 200 or 300 years. That was part of the role that the Catholic Church had in our society. The complex itself is partly a hospital and partly a monastery, and here you see the bishop opening it, and the nuns, maybe they're singing the love of God on the courtyard. Another reason why this building in the so-called Delft School of Architecture, the traditionalist Delft School of Architecture, the confessional Delft School of Architecture, the school that was later kicked out of Delft by the modernists, was built in this timeless thing, is that it was built just after the war, in the Reconstruction era, and basically people wanted to forget the war. So many things that were looking very new had to look as if the war had never happened, and that is also a relatively remarkable thing. In Holland, our society until relatively recently was divided in columns. So there was a Protestant hospital, which was the first project, and there was the Catholic hospital in which we had to work now. In the same way that the Catholics and the Protestants had their own television stations, they had their own labor unions, they had their own newspapers, they had their own schools, and of course, at some moment, also the socialists or the secularists also had their own institutions. Our society was very much organized according to these columns. And one of the interesting things is if you have to redo a building from 1957, is that it becomes part also of your own history. I could have been born there. My parents could have worked there. An uncle could have been killed in the war. All these things are so close by that also this build-up of society and the time out of which this thing came was part of the way I grew up. I grew up an Orthodox Protestant, and I was given certain opinions about Catholics which were not nice. This, we'll get back to that. This complex, looking as if it had been there for a couple of centuries, behind closed walls, around a courtyard in a Renaissance, very mobile order, with a beautiful chapel, was a very hypocritical building, a Protestant would say. It was made of concrete. It was actually a much more modern building than it appears to be, and that became, I think, a very important design theme in the transformation of it. This beautiful hypocritical building had great artworks, great ornamentation, and really also through these artworks expressed very much its time. We said to our clients, the hospital, if you are moving two hospitals into a new location, a lot of the practices that are part of your hospital now will not move because they are community-based. And why don't we move all these community-based practices to the nicest part of your existing complex, because that way we can keep this monument, or it was not a monument then. We can keep this complex, and that's worthwhile. That is something valuable to do, and they bought into that idea. Also, because we explained them like developers, this is almost risk-free development because you already have your tenants. We can start right away. The complex itself is the main garden with behind here the monastery, two wings that were used for the nurses, and this is the original main building with the entrance here. And since we could only find 4,000 or 5,000 square meters of program, we basically had to, and that was one of the first elements, to make a new entrance on this site. We could not make an entrance in the main building. And that is, I think, what informed the first steps of the project. If the entrance was originally here, we said that the functions should enter here from the street, and if you make a new entrance there, you also need parking spaces. So we needed to demolish part of the structure in order to be able to make this entrance and these parking spaces. This is a rendering of our initial idea. He said we cut a couple of holes in the wall, we have new entrances, and we cut away this part of this building because that will create the space for parking. We wanted to cut only a part of it because from an urban configuration, there's a whole lot of stuff happening here as well. All these buildings in this Renaissance typology were like set pieces as if they were an old Italian town. So we said we cannot take away the entire building because it would destroy the urban composition. Behind the wall, we then cut the building such that the interior, the concrete interior of this, brick structure would become visible. And also here you see all kinds of concrete elements becoming visible. So what we did is basically showing the modern building behind the hypocritical Catholic building that was there. In part, we built also a new element next to this garden, in which we then made, together with the artist Berend Strik, a large mural piece. This is the building section where you can really see very well how the original building was made, and as you can see also from the detailing, all the new stuff that we made has no compositional relationship to the existing building. What I like very much in this is also that we kept this simple form, but we also kept the shade, so it really has this sort of historic layer still in it. And here you see how we kept part of the building such that in the colossal, or in the order around this garden, the building would still be there. The sculptural piece itself is made of, if you see the intestines of the building, the sculptural piece is also intestines. We had someone who's really good with molding clay, make brains and a kidney and a heart and a lung and all these things. And we cast that into concrete. And originally, the concrete was supposed to be a bit more, let's say, brownish, a bit more intestine-ish, but that didn't work. So it's only when we made it pink, because everyone knows that intestines don't look pink, that actually the client and the future tenants went with this idea. And the artist Berend Strik made some glass mosaics in it. We work a lot with artists, and I work a lot with artists because I think it is really interesting to also explore the boundaries of the profession in that way. This is a curtain that Strik made in a villa that we made. We thought of the curtain while thinking about Barnett Newman's painting, Who's Afraid of Blue, Yellow and Red, and especially liking the red of the painting. And this is a project that we did together in our Salzburg project, the beer pavilion, because these people here will be older people, and older people in Austria drink a lot of beer, especially on Sunday morning. On Sunday morning when they go food shopping, drink beer and listen to Hoompa music. And we thought that that these type of social functions needed to be accommodated in this plan. And since we had this weak corner here, almost like Pleshnik, we proposed the beer pavilion there. And when we were thinking about that, we thought on the one hand we would like to make it in a regionaal style. From out of the motto, we build nothing new here. We make a regional style of architecture that the artist, of course, then messed up completely. But we also thought that if we want to be, let's say, realistic and show what is happening there, an aim for architecture should be to make, let's say, things visible, then it would be very nice if we can make the pavilion out of beer. So we developed glass tanks in which we could then have beer, so that the beer pavilion would literally be made of beer. And then we start thinking, if we really want to be realistic, we should not only look at the positive, but also at the negative. With beer comes urine. And the project slowly developed, even with the help of Heineken, a Dutch beer company, into a giant recycling machine of beer and urine, where these tanks would ultimately contain either. So it would be a sort of giant slushy machine of yellow fluids in a regionaal style. We went pretty far. This is a section of the plan with the bar below and the toilets above. But I think it's these type of insights that you need, the positive and the negative, that you need, that realism works in only if you make it real. That is very important. A final project that I'm not going to show is a project that we also made with Strik, who is himself an embroidery artist, and that we made for two twin sisters that have the syndrome of Gilles de la Tourette, and in which we used embroidery and the act of making a project with them as a way of internalizing for them their new house. But back to Deventer, I had Berend also make these windows of a glass application, a technique that was used in the 50s, often by the modern artists of that time. And in that he used imagery from the old hospital, so that basically this entire project, this entire transformation, this relatively radical transformation, because transforming a monastery which is dark, which has ritualized circulation, into a new building requires some drastic measures. And so this relatively drastic transformation, I wanted to make such that it wasn't so much a contrast against the existing building, but I did want it to show the existing, and I also thought that bringing light in, bringing clarity in it would satisfy all my Protestant cravings that I had, and my Protestant relationship to this building. So the sections that we made in it and the courtyards that we made in it are very transparent. You see the concrete structure, and you even see in the detailing very much the actual building appearing. And I think that in itself was very interesting, because maybe rather than this guy, I in this whole process I felt more than this guy, this sort of weird, and because it confronted me with my history as someone from an Orthodox Protestant background, I felt like that personality had to be put into the building, and I'm only slowly starting to realize how much the way I grew up in an Orthodox Protestant background, in an environment where, and this is a literal quotation, Catholics are considered worse than Negroes. That is what people said when I grew up in my Protestant environment. Sorry for the words. Where that sort of informs also, I think, the architecture. And the architecture that then starts to play this entire Dutch tradition of Catholicism versus Protestantism, the purity that Protestants want in relation to the beauty and the hypocrisy of Catholicism, in my words. That, of course, the fact that also as a Protestant you want beauty, made it impossible to make all my interventions very austere. For instance, in the chapel we had to build a new circulation system, and that looks something like this, where suddenly this piece of furniture that we built in the chapel, this new circulation system, develops, I think, an all different aesthetic sensibility. Concrete. We were very lucky to be able to, because we were rich, to do a lot in this building, so we could have a lot of artworks. The final thing that I want to show you is the stained glass windows that Strik made, again based on the existing artworks and using imagery from the former hospital as if to keep its history in. And I don't know if there is I don't think there is a punchline to this entire story, but what I did want to show is that there's a lot of, I think that if you allow yourself to become really interested in your environment around you, and both from a pragmatic or rational point of view, as from the fact that you cannot deny your own personality, in that if you allow that to creep into your work, you are able to achieve remarkable things and give, I think, on the one hand, a new relevance to the profession, and at the same time, you can create an architecture or an urban planning that is still open in such a way that a lot of people can actually use it or read it or enter in it in their own way. Thank you very much. Good.
Before we open the floor for questions, I just want to thank you for the talk. I mean, it really found it very inspiring personally, and I think it enabled the ambition of this series overall, not only this term, but in subsequent terms, of wanting to imagine forms of intelligence need to be designed that would operate both with agency and intelligence that doesn't encode itself within one camp or another, but slips between the two. So I say that less for your benefit and more for the students and the faculties, that this is what I see in the work, and this is why you're here, and I appreciate that. Having said that, like, I look at the work and I was taken by this notion of repetition, and I don't want to like enter a kind of analysis of deluge, so I'll frame it in a different way. I'll frame it around the idea of context. So in a number of the projects, you know, context has a history in architecture and its use and its deployment. And as I see you use existing context, it slips between a number of modalities. Sometimes it's there to create the possibilities of consensus, so agreement. At some points, it seems to be redeployed as a kind of critical commentary on an existing condition. Other times, you seem to use it as a creative detour to elicit other imaginations by having a sort of exact understanding of what's there and then moving it through. And I'm just wondering, having expressed that in the lecture, these different modalities, how do you, when you think about not repetition, but context in your work, how it starts to operate and how it unfolds? I mean, if that's a question, more further commentary on that.
Yeah, I would say it. Can you? Can you just tell us the question a little bit? Can I repeat the question? Yeah. John asked that we use this theme of repetition, and I made a sort of shallow reference, because I think shallow references are good, to Différence et Répétition, a book by Gilles Deleuze. And he said, if I want to take it simple, it is about how you use context. And sometimes you use context as a way to, for instance, take with you a community. Sometimes you take context as an irritant. And can you explain a bit further the use of context in your work? And then my answer would, I think, be yes, because that's always the easy answer in front of intelligent people. No is more difficult, but I do think that I honestly don't know what happens when. I think that in a design process, there is there are so many things going on simultaneously that they sort of tumble over each other. And I find that I have, as a person, always an immense respect for what is already there, because there are reasons that it is already there, and at the same time they become an irritant, or they become something that I use. And in this case, I deployed it, I think, in the first project and in the Salzburg project, initially as a way in relating to the community, and in the Salzburg project much more than in the urban planning project in Deventer. That initial relationship turned into an obsession with Austrianness. You know that in this project there's a sculpture of Arnold Schwarzenegger, there is a discourse on strangers, there's a talk about beer, there is this sort of on the one hand you use it out of respect, and the second you start playing with it. And I do think that sometimes these obsessions, or the use of context as a generator can become almost offensive or contrarian, but in the end I always think no, that is good, because in the end this beer pavilion, for instance, as something that comes out of the context, is also for 75-year-old Germans a much nicer beer pavilion than you would traditionally make. So I think in the end it starts with respect, but I also think that by digesting it through my design and my personality and my intellectual interest and others, in the end, something what is an irritant will become something that is good again. I don't try to shock with it. I really try to process it. It's part of what is there. Also, I am part of what is there, and that all gets sort of processed. Yeah, and it's, I often ask myself that same question, and then I even ask myself, is this really happening? Or does this? Hmm? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, there's the initial urine of that first project is, of course, being blacklisted by Dutch developers, in the sense that literally Dutch developers, because I was treading on their territory, starting to call the authorities and say this needs to stop. So part of the urine is maybe there. And no, let me, no, I think there's, it's a, what, at any moment, every plan has its own purpose and its own context. And the question that is, I think that is always very important is to what extent do you allow the urine to appear? If in the urban projects in Deventer, the urine is only in the relationship that I have with the developers, that would not be, I think, good enough. But I... It makes an argument about urban planning and the way people do urban planning. In that sense, it's a theoretical project, a theoretical planning project. Yeah. Yeah, but do you think then that the fact that the intestines became pink is that's a way of making the urine pink? Because I do find that there in this project, this building was just opened last week. Suddenly, a lot of these elements that were relatively withdrawn or operated on a different level in the first Deventer project appear again because they start getting form. That's something that I think any architect always worries about. I mean, it is a worry because I employ 15 to 20 people. I think that I still work according to the values that I have for myself, but it's true that the type of work and the environments in which you operate force you to utilize those value sets in different ways. Yeah.
I actually had a very different take on it than that insofar as it always seemed to me that you would introduce the projects in very straightforward and pragmatic terms.
Mm-hmm.
And yet there, at the end, even with the urban planning projects where you use repetition, it becomes a kind of delirium so that I don't mean to say that I saw urine everywhere, but I certainly smelled it.
Uh-huh.
And Jeff is indicating. So it's actually work necessarily work. And I too was kind of struck by the notion that at first you were reacting against a kind of authorship, but then in the later projects seem much more at ease in introducing yourself
But
actually was struck
uh-huh.
by a kind of consistency to the work and in a way a kind of growth, a kind of maturity from your own point of view. This boy who goes to Austria and is overwhelmed by these folks who he can't understand other than clearly they hate him.
Uh-huh. They hate architects. They didn't hate me personally. In the end, they loved me because I told them I would build something new.
Until in the end, it seemed almost autobiographical, the description of your own background and
Yeah.
coming to terms with this deeply saturated site.
Huh.
So I thought it was remarkable on a number of
Yeah. Last question. Yeah.
From the region, not the front row, nor the back. The middle.
No, no, I don't design around that. Basically, what I make room by making 23 million, and it's almost as simple as that. And then I tell my clients with the goodwill that I have, because he trusts me, that I said this is a remarkable complex. There's fantastic art in there. Why don't we work with an artist now? And in the end, that saved us, because halfway during this project, when we had already had the building permit application out, it suddenly became a national monument, which would normally mean that you had to redo your entire project and had to go into all kinds of committees, and you basically lose a couple of years and a lot of money. But even the simple fact that I had an artist already on board and that we had been relatively careful and ambitious with the project allowed me to get it through committee in a couple of weeks.
Well, Matthijs, thank you again.
Okay.